Alrighty, sorry about the delay. I think that's it. Okay, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator host, Fraggeth, and today we're going to be reading more of Absolution by one Jeff Vandermeer. Um, Previously on, let's see, it's been a whole long week for me, so let's see if I can remember. Um, Old Jim makes his way down to the Forgotten Coast and the Bleakersville region, um, and he's been assigned to be the bartender at a local bar, a bar that turns out we, the audience, are familiar with if we've read the rest of the series up until now, specifically Acceptance. And when he gets there, he's actually got two presents waiting for him. One is an upright piano that is just standing in the middle of the lawn, and the other is his daughter, or at least someone who claims to be his daughter, or is told to claim that she is his daughter. She's about the right age. She looks exactly like his daughter the day she left. The last time he saw her, that is, which isn't quite the day she left, but the last time he saw her anyway. Um, and this freaks him out just a smidge, as it would. Um, it's probably not his daughter. Uh, it's hard to say. It's hard to be sure, given that Central works in mysterious ways, and Jack Severance, the gift giver in this instance, works in ways even more mysterious and particularly erratic. Something you're going to notice about Jack Severance is that and it's already kind of been mentioned, he's playing his own game all the time. Um, he's playing some game at some point with basically everyone all the time. We're going to learn more about what makes Jack tick. Um, Not a lot, though, to be honest. It winds up being kind of academic in the end, but you'll see. Things are going to get very interesting vis-a-vis Jack Severance. Um, so old Jim's daughter, in quotes, job is to the daughter is in quotes, not job. Her job is to keep an eye on the Seance and Science Brigade. Um, for Central and Jack, and incidentally keep an eye on old Jim as well. And they get off to a pretty rough start um, because it's kind of mortifying having to pretend to be someone's daughter when clearly the person knows you're probably not their daughter. And it's all just it's head jobs within head jobs. Um, what was the other thing? Oh yes, he shakes down old Jim shakes down Man Boy Slim uh, in order to find out anything he can um, about the Mutter, his relationship to the Mutter, what he and the Mutter were up to, and what they saw on the cameras. And they foretold all kinds of horrible things. Um, Drunk Boat saw his death. It didn't quite happen as advertised, but nonetheless, he did die. And this understandably has Manboy Slim somewhat freaked out. There was something else that happened, but I can't remember what it is. Jackie Severance is Jack's daughter, is acting as a go-between, and she's got her own thing going on that we're going to learn a bit more about, but we already kind of know um, in terms of keeping an eye on the Seance and Science Brigade. in a more direct fashion than Jack Severance is. At this point, old Jim is in the dark as ever. This is apparently standard operating procedure forever for Central. Anybody working in the Southern Reach is given the mushroom treatment, as it were, kept in the dark and fed crap. Um, so there's going to be a lot of there's going to be a degree of misdirection. Oh, hello, Grassman. Part with the alligator tracker description was crazy. Yes, we're going places. It's a slow burn. This part is definitely a slow burn, but we are going to ramp up. Actually, we're going to have a pretty dramatic ending to this week's segment, in fact, and some weird stuff happening in between. I think that's it. I'm not going to flip through to find out. So let's assume I'm right. We also had a story about the house centipede incident, which involves an earwig. In this case, an earwig being a something that gets into your head, something you hear that gets in your brain and makes you do stuff that you wouldn't otherwise do. Uh, in this case, it involves the chopping off of limbs because you think you've stepped on something that's unspeakable. House centipede, and so there's head jobs abound in this book. We're seeing this book is kind of talking about a lot of the formation of how Central goes about doing stuff. Um, sort of their hypnosis slash suggestion plans, but it turns out they've kind of already been doing it for ages. So it's not new at this point, but they are starting to use it in new and interesting ways, testing the limits, as it were. Alrighty, with that, I'm going to get started, and we will proceed with more of Absolution. Integration. 11. The Patriot. The dreams of the biologists after the rogue had been potent enough to result. What? Oh, I see what I did wrong. The dreams of the biologists after the rogue had been potent enough to result in catastrophic damage. But the medic had been subject to none of that psychic damage in the aftermath of the rogue because the medic had fled, or retreated, or disengaged, however they put it in the file. After debriefing, file missing / withheld, the medic didn't skip a beat, reassigned to another top secret mission. So as the biologists huddled in the remains of City Hall, dreaming dreams gifted to them by rabbit cameras, the medic had been eating 3 squares a day somewhere, living in relative luxury at a central safe house. One biologist survived longer than the rest, despite her dreams. The last entry in her journal read, quote, "They are coming. We cannot hold them back." Unquote. When the Central Rescue Team reached Dead Town, she, quote, "put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger, despite our pleading with her to stop." Unquote. In her jacket pocket, they found a horrifying account of her last days, and clutched in her hand like a talisman the bobber from a dead alligator. By then, the medic would have been happily preparing for his next assignment, reading through mission directives and protocols, maybe slowly chewing bites of a ham sandwich while doing so. A consummate professional. Despite his need, old Jim felt a reluctance to speak with the medic, who through Cass had agreed to meet at the lighthouse. This despite his prep, as if thorough prep were not enough, and he would need some kind of cleansing ritual after. Almost against his will, he got out of bed the next morning and at the appointed time drove to the lighthouse. Reluctant, too, because the truth was he didn't much care for the lighthouse. A tool shed stood precarious next to the lighthouse building. It marked the last moment before a ridge of soil and coquina morphed into a line of rocks stretching out to sea, parallel to the beach. Coquina, as we remember from way back when we read the Area X trilogy, is a sort of a concrete mix that has shells and other material in it, as I recall. At low tide, the place where soil and coquina met rock felt like a good place to meet, shielded from the lighthouse road by the shed, but good lines of sight otherwise. The lighthouse, looming in its disorienting swirl of black and white, felt like it would fall on top of him. If Saul the lighthouse keeper was up there, he wouldn't be able to see old Jim through the little windows in the side of the lighthouse. The point was to watch the sea, not the ground. Soon enough, then, a heavy set barrel of a man in a leather jacket, flannel shirt, and jeans, with black boots, walked down the trail toward him. He'd lost most of his hair, this man, but white strands floated out to the sides like wisps of fog. He had the gait and build of someone who lifted weights but also drank a lot of beer, with a potbelly jutting from the bottom of his shirt, a jacket bursting tight across the shoulders. The man's face as he approached closer had the pugnacious quality of an old-timey boxer, and his hand when he took it from his jacket pocket had a meaty aspect, fingers stubby and rough, although with carefully manicured nails. His handshake managed to be both clammy and dry, making old Jim withdraw from it even as the medic tried to clasp more tightly. The medic stated his false name, his rank in the brigade, said he was proud to serve his country and would answer, quote, "Any questions I can for you." Old Jim was still staring at the stubby fingers, now quiescent by his side, wondered how, as medic, he'd been at suturing wounds or bedside manner. His voice had all the elegance of a rusty axe slowly being pulled from deep in a thick log. He masticated words like if he didn't, they would come out the other end uncomfortably whole. "I've got respect for you, coming on at your age to run things, you know," the medic said, which felt like a way of telling old Jim he'd done his homework, seen his file, too. Preamble and greetings he'd lavish on someone who was deserving, so he just got down to it. "I'm going to ask you some questions about the Dead Town expedition." The chance of mics and other surveillance was practically nil, so the medic should feel comfortable.
Sure, sure. I'm up for that. I truly am, you know, sir."
His face had such a thick cast to it, such broad features. Oh, there's a comma there, not a period. Such broad features, old Jim wasn't able to read him, didn't know how to take the addition of sir.
"When the generator died, what happened to the biologist who disappeared?"
The medic shrugged.
"Same as always, sir. He'd discovered the secret of the generator and the conditioning didn't work anymore. I told him to be quiet about it. He wouldn't, and I had to eliminate him."
What did it matter now, the continuing shrugs appeared to convey? It mattered to old Jim, but he needed to pretend it didn't, even though hearing it uttered so plain felt like an abomination. The casual complicity, as if old Jim should agree it didn't matter.
The secret of the generator? Yes, sir. The subliminal messages. The whole point of the thing, as I saw it, save lives in the long run, you know. Central cleared me, said it was a solid decision, said the circumstances were not ideal, being at war and all. At war? With infiltration of the coast and all, and needing the hypnosis experiments to proceed. Self-defense, if you think about it, sir.
Self-defense?
Yes, sir. He would have killed me and the others, if not, because of where his mind was at.
The medic was as futile as a file in his matter-of-factness. The medic could state his truth without shame because Central had validated it. This aging man with the wispy shreds of hair and the sausage fingers who talked of murder with such ease. It made old Jim deeply sad, sick, almost, to think that the medic existed in the same operational universe with him. Why had the medic not been exiled to his own island? Something about a faint pencil mark erasure in the mutter's journal had raised another question for the medic, made it possible to pivot away from his disgust.
And how many people were on the expedition? How many, sir? Yes. What number?
Was the man stupid or stalling?
Oh, yes. Common misconceptions, sir, the way the files present it, I'd imagine. 25, not 24. One got eaten during the alligator experiment and bled out.
The thought came to him, in that brief interregnum where old Jack couldn't think of what to say, that this was another joke of Jack's. That this person was an actor like Cass was supposed to be, at the start. Except the medic was too bad at it. He had to be real. The information he was giving old Jim had to be real.
Tell me about the alligator experiment.
The medic frowned this time, withdrew into himself, his gaze distant, hands in his jacket pockets like he'd suddenly gotten cold in the sea breeze.
Not my area, sir. Not my story to tell, not that one. Look for the keywords teacup and china shop in the archives. Might be what you need.
He had a frisson of insight about something Jack had said back at Central.
No need, old Jim said. I know it was an experiment to see if people would do some routine task while also, without remembering it, perform some other, more clandestine tasks. To see if they could be programmed.
He drew up short, had almost added, right?
Yes, sir, that's about it,
The medic admitted after a moment of hesitation.
Teacup, though?
Old Jim said in a cheery tone. Really?
Yes, sir. Full tea service on a tray. He was holding it. Almost made it the whole way through the line of gators while they did up the harnesses and prepared for release.
The tyrant, huh?
Yes, sir.
His face had brightened at the mention of the name.
Always was the difficult one, sir. Still might be, for someone.
Not my problem, that emphasis. Not at all. A man had died, and the man-eater had been allowed to escape into the swamp, there to form a pact with the rogue. Intolerable. Staring up at the lighthouse, finding it hard to look at the medic, feeling ever more disgusted, he thought of another, more current question, one pertaining to Henry, in a way.
Why did they switch the lenses? The lighthouse lenses, between the one on Failure Island and this one right here.
He'd seen it in the files from 5 years ago, and it had nagged at him, recognizing how much effort it had taken, how much convincing it had taken of the Coast Guard, which had jurisdiction over lighthouses.
Sir, the brigade at that time felt they learned all they could from the Failure Island lens, subjected it to all kinds of hocus-pocus fiddly-diddly. And now it was time to turn to the one on the mainland, but it wasn't as easy to access, being more of a tourist spot. Thus the switch, sir. Is that all?
He meant the Herculean effort, he meant the Herculean physical effort as well as the bureaucratic one, but also stuck on how stupid hocus pocus fiddly diddly made the medic sound.
Well, sir, the Fresnel lenses, they're a powerful magic,
The medic said, and maybe there was a wink there, too, and maybe there wasn't. It felt like the leprechaun version of something Henry would say. Maybe he should have been adding another task to the long list about the types of experiments the S&SB had done to coax magic out of lighthouse lenses. Yet he was still stuck in the moment where the medic had watched as a man had been killed by an alligator. When old Jim had said nothing for too long, the medic said,
"We have been looking for signals, sir, and now I understand you will be looking for traces?"
Traces?
"Because we want it to come out into the open."
You mean force it? Old Jim asked, and wondered what worlds lay between his definition of it and the medic's definition.
"Yes."
Why?
"So we can control it or destroy it."
Do you think that's my mission?
"What other is there, sir?"
The seas were calm, bereft of much interest except seagulls and pelicans. The brief knife of a dolphin's fin could have been a wave. Out on the beach, the girl Gloria walked with her mom, but on the far side, and he only knew her by her red windbreaker and something solid in her walk. He was undecided about the risk versus the reward of asking the medic directly about Henry or the rabbit cameras.
"How long have you been with the S&SB?" "About a decade, sir."
Correct. The file told the same story. Before that, overseas, but on another coastal job, mostly acting like a foreign entity inflicted on someone else's shores. After all, he'd already had the experience of being an infliction.
"Have you been to Deadtown since?" "Since what, sir?"
The expedition.
No, I haven't."
Why not? Old Jim asked.
"Haven't been instructed to. The lighthouse is our focus now. Have you been?"
I'll get around to it. The medic nodded, and there came a shift in the wind, some indiscernible mote removed from the arc and wheel of the heavens, old Jim overtaken by a feeling he couldn't identify, an urge to dive down into the heart of things. Did the mutter escape with you?
"Who?"
The woman studying the fiddler crabs on the expedition.
"No, sir," the medic said. "She wasn't with Central. Only I was."
Did you ask to see the files about what happened during the storm with the stranger?
"No."
Did you ever investigate further, in any sense, or receive further information from Central as regards the stranger?
"No, sir."
Do you have any thoughts about the identity or current whereabouts of the stranger?
"No, sir."
So you have no idea who the stranger might have been?
"No, sir."
Was that crumbling of his features that he was about to cry? To bawl, perhaps? Perhaps not. He couldn't read the medic at all, as if he came from a culture so foreign they only had 5 or 6 words in common. Was he part of Central's experiment? The stranger?
"No, not that I was aware."
Who would have been aware, if not you?
"I wouldn't know, sir."
The medic kept shuffling closer to old Jim, for reasons old Jim couldn't fathom, and old Jim kept stepping back, so that now they stood where the rocks formed a rough semicircle, with the startling gleam of a sandbank jutting out to form the rest of the circle, in shallow water. It felt like a spotlight, with the dark, rich blue of deeper water to both sides.
What do you think happened out there to the other expedition members? You mean besides the mother, sir? Because I think you mean the mother got out too, which I never knew that before.
The medic said it with no particular malice or interest. No, he ate the meat and potatoes put in front of him every day, and that was enough for him. No strange dreams for him. No rogue running riot across a field of smoldering rabbits. He slept the quiet sleep of the certain, and old Jim almost envied him.
I'll ask you again. What do you think happened during the storm? Manifestation of the foreign entity,
He said with a solemn, almost worshipful tone.
and how do you define foreign entity? An entity that is foreign, sir. Can you elaborate?
Old Jim asked, and he could not keep a current of sarcasm from his voice.
An old force in the world.
Old Jim didn't like that answer. It sounded too mysterious. It conjured up an ancient army headed toward a gap in the world filled with green light. As if some religion had infiltrated Central, this way he kept encountering a quasi-mystical element, even in how Jack talked about where he got his intel.
How would you name it?
Old Jim asked, as he noticed how close the medic had drifted toward him.
Unnameable, sir. That's what the Seance and Science Brigade is here for, sir. To name it? Yes, sir. To name it.
Old Jim gauged the waves, the distance, the risk, and knew he couldn't stop himself. He came close as if to end the meeting, shake the medic's hand. Then he shoved the man off the rocks, as hard as he could, toward the sand and shallow water. Watched as that particular barrel managed to put his hands out, break his fall. Get to his feet with surprising agility, arms covered in sand. Standing there in that semicircle of spotlight, staring at old Jim, devoid of outrage or anger. Somehow that chilled him more than anything. That the medic didn't sputter or wave his arms or shout, but just stood there in the waves rippling over the sandbank, staring at old Jim. Staring and staring as old Jim walked back to shore over the rocks. 12. Old Decomp. The darkness of the night beyond his desk beguiled him now at times, the way it could feel like the prow of a boat and the mutters of the open waters beyond almost like words rising from the depths. A key from the kitchen hook sometimes slipped into his hand now as he went out onto the deck to enjoy the sunset, as if he had the muscle memory of some other place, and there having been too many other places to identify which one. But he liked the solid, cold feel of it in his hand, an old key, brass, with complex teeth. The key in his hand oddly calmed him, like playing the piano. So, too, did receiving news that Jack had gotten him the dead town evidence. Although it was Jackie, not Jack, who in curt fashion gave old Jim a caustic call to let him know it had been delivered and where to go to wade through it. She gave him the address, then said, "Next time, even if it's Central you need, go through me, not him." Chain of command. Breached, didn't know his place, but still couldn't say Jack's name over a secure line. It would feel good to escape them both for a while, along with the files, S&SB management, and village bar duties. Escaping, too, the sea debris reports of his predecessor, which still came by fax as if no one had told Central the man was dead.
Round trip, get in the truck.
old Jim said when Cass came around for their regular debrief later that morning.
"We've got all the Dead Town expedition files waiting for us. Just a bit of a trip."
Sure thing, boss. He decided to take that as earnest, not sarcastic, in part because he'd kept the weight of intel on him, so why shouldn't she feel lighter than he did? Maybe he was just getting used to her, but it felt more comfortable with her there on the passenger side than it did empty. Even if he did have to move some maps and file folders and toss a couple of fast food bags into the back. Did David Shears tell you anything? Cass asked as he adjusted the truck's side mirror, which had gotten turned inward somehow in his travels. Had the medic told him anything? Not really. It was more that the certainty of the medic had disturbed him and felt like an implacable force, but he regretted pushing him into the sea. It felt so childish now that he hoped Cass never found out.
"Name, rank, serial number. What I do know is he's dangerous. Watch your back when he's around."
I always keep a physical distance when we have to meet, have someone else in the room with me. Even saying that, Cass had a serene aspect about her that old Jim hadn't seen, like they'd done this 100 times before. As if, in another reality, they'd been running this op for a decade and been through the wars together. The smile she gave him as she'd hoisted herself up into the seat, one hand on the doorframe, conveyed a trust neither of them had earned yet. Was that just a young person thing?
"Don't you want to know where we're going?"
She looked over at him with a glint of weary mischief. I've just come from hearing the early morning complaints of a bunch of psychics, seance freaks, and submersible techs. Just get me as fucking far away from here as possible, even if we're driving right up to the gates of hell. He gave her a raised eyebrow for the hyperbole.
"Almost. It's between here and Bleekersville."
Everything is between here and Bleekersville, Jim. Well, she had that right. Hank's Premium Memories, read the sign at the address, with the legend, When you're hankerin' for the best. A storage locker business converted out of what appeared to be a doppelganger of the Starlight Lounge. What was it with the long barracks pillbox style of local architecture? Hankering for a better slogan, Cass said as they approached, still rife with manic energy. Old Jim said nothing, not sure he liked her joking tone. But seriously, Cass said, sitting straighter in her seat, this looks like a great place to get ambushed.
"Agreed. You strapped?"
Yep. You?
"Yeah."
The guns were old, from the archives, but effective. With all the add-on structures, the place was not just cruel to the eye, but an actual maze. So old Jim parked out front, next to a trashy green sports car right in front of the office. The white guy behind the counter in a bright red shirt and dreads gave them a map. He drew an arrow with a ballpoint pen to indicate a circular structure out back. Just walk through this front building to the right, he advised, and leave your vehicle here. Back lot's rutted.
"Too rutted for a truck?"
Old Jim asked. Maybe he sounded incredulous. Maybe he almost wanted to argue about it, given the state of his nerves. Too rutted for a tank, buddy, in my opinion, but do what you want. Thanks, buddy, Cass said, and nudged old Jim away from the counter. So they took the advice, although old Jim didn't like leaving the truck, and they walked through the main building to the back. It had dozens of doors and more empty corridors off both sides. Their footfalls echoed, and he could hear the wheeze of old plumbing. Out the other end, through a glass door propped open with a cinder block green with mold, and into the huge gravel lot beyond, littered with a scattering of shotgun shells. The smell of motor oil and burnt rubber was almost a taste in his mouth. A welter of potholes full of muddy water dominated that space, and his thoughts slid from the medic's blithe description of murder to an even more visceral place where the texture of tadpoles and eels brushed against his skin. And maybe that was just how unclean he felt after talking to the medic, like the potholes were an accurate depiction of the man's soul. "I don't like those potholes," Cass said. "If this was someplace else, I'd sweep those holes for mines first." Where had she been, then, before? At the lot's far corner, maybe 70 feet away, a windowless stone silo squatted, framed by sprawling pines and oaks behind. A kind of stone approximation of a yurt, with a vaguely chimney-like protrusion just above the roof.
That feels like a remnant of someone else's history, old Jim said.
Good times, she said sarcastically.
In theory, they've shoved all the evidence from the Deadtown disaster inside.
But something already felt off, even if he couldn't put his finger on it. "Did you request they dump it in a brick shithouse with bad vibes, or is that Central giving us the finger?"
It's not brick.
"You know what I mean. Looks like the place a serial killer takes his victims to."
I do know what you mean,
old Jim said. But they came close anyway, across that messed up parking lot. The potholes had the look of terrestrial tidal pools, with ankle-turning potential and a disturbing aspect of cloudy water, even though it hadn't rained recently. Old Jim didn't like how his face appeared distorted every time he looked down. The tower silo's pockmarked stone had dull green discolorations across the curving surface, mapped to splotches of lichen. Some underlying assault that expressed itself as the melting of the shell rock used to build it, so that a swell of breaking lesions appeared out of that rough surface. The door had a small 24 painted in white high up to the left. Coincidence, or Central having a grim laugh? Old Jim caught a whiff of rotten eggs, of dead animal, but that might just be coming from the seepage ditch before the tree line. "How do we get in?"
There's supposed to be a hidden latch, a key inside to lock the door on the way out.
Cass gave him a sharp look of disbelief, standing there together with the disquieting door. Security by obscurity? So anyone could come along and open this damn door.
Highly unlikely, and probably Jack's idea, not Central.
Met him twice in group meetings. He asked me too many questions.
Best place to meet him, though, old Jim said. Now help me find this latch.
Jack didn't ask too many questions of any old grunt, that was for sure. Her file had caught his attention, a file old Jim hadn't seen. She just stood there, arms crossed, while he felt absurdly like he was patting down the door for weapons. No, he realized, she wasn't just standing there, but watchful, like she expected an ambush, checking lines of sight so no one could sneak up on them unexpected, because truth was, they were exposed, and not even the side of the truck to shield them. Fact, too, the way Cass carried herself, there was no tell about her weapon. Shoulder holster, maybe. Ah, there was the latch, disguised as a rough jut of stone next to the door, and no doubt how this place was Central's in the discovery, and had been for a long time. The odd satisfaction of the click, as if he had solved some larger puzzle. He shot Cass a proud smile, and the door opened outward, unleashing a rotting fish stench mixed with a chemical odor so strong it sent them both reeling back across the land of horrible potholes.
Shit,
he said, his boots wet. Waterproof, but the water had a viscous quality.
Jesus Christ, Jim, what died in there?
Well, everything, apparently. Back at the truck, he had a thermos of water and a supply of fresh handkerchiefs in the glove box, for which he got mercilessly teased even as Cass accepted a couple to cover her face.
Hankering for a handkerchief, Jim? You running a black market for handkerchiefs? Anyway, yeah, this'll work.
Pulling herself together, looking like a bandit because she'd chosen a black one.
I have the handkerchiefs.
He said in muffled fashion from under his, white with red polka dots, hoping moistening them would deaden the smell,
Because you never know when you'll need one.
although really it was one of those habits the reason for which was lost to time and history. Too many ops, too many rituals.
Right, sure. I can think of tons of uses.
Then she sobered, or he thought she had, but said,
Let's hit a convenience store after this, Jim. Make some money on the side.
she was about to walk back out across the parking lot when old Jim frowned, held her back with one outstretched arm.
Let's wait under the awning a moment.
He'd heard something, or thought he had. Something clicked behind her eyes, and she hugged the wall with him. A moment later, a pickup pulled up in front of the stone silo, bucking over the potholes like the driver had done it a million times before and didn't give a shit about his truck's suspension. 3 men clambered out, in jeans, t-shirts, baseball caps, armed with rifles. Cass had her sidearm out so fast he still didn't know where she'd drawn from, silencer screwed on in seconds. A brutal-looking Beretta. The look on her face told him she was prepared to have a firefight right there in the parking lot. He could see now how the open button-down shirt allowed her concealment, but also a quick draw.
Don't, he said. We're not law enforcement. We're not even supposed to be here. Not officially.
She gave him a hard glance, softened, nodded, lowered the Beretta, but didn't reholster. Fair enough. He had his Walther in a shoulder holster in easy reach, and a tiny Central-made pea-shooter strapped to his ankle. 1 bullet. The men had assembled in a row. The men had assembled in a row, and now were firing furiously at the side of the silo, kicking up stone chips and dust until they had exhausted their ammo. Then they jumped back in the truck, which popped a wheelie and drifted in a shriek of gravel before finding purchase and roaring out of sight around the corner, leaving behind a smell of burnt rubber and a haze of black smoke from the tailpipe.
What the fuck?
Cass managed to get out. Old Jim had already emerged and, hands on his hips, stared out at the stone silo.
What if they come back? They won't,
Old Jim said.
Those were really low caliber rifles. Not enough juice to penetrate that elephant hide. Local talent, but not yahoos or killers. Huh. How'd you know?
That felt good. He couldn't deny it.
Just a sense you get after a while. I think they thought we were in there, and they were just supposed to scare us. Surprise us.
Maybe even sent by whoever had left the belt buckle for Cass. Had the same feel. Peevish,
The attendant must be deaf,
she said.
I bet he won't be there when we leave. But who, Jim? Why?
He shrugged. Did Jack or Jackie hate his request? Did Jack or Jackie hate his request more? He didn't like to think the men had been friends of Man Boy Slim. That would be a whole different matter.
Let's just get on with the job and get out of here,
He said. Kicking at the gravel, plop, hit a pothole. The damp handkerchiefs helped enough for them to pull the door open and survive the interior. Although the door slammed shut no matter what you did, so old Jim found a loose bracket to serve as a door jamb, and Cass groped around and found a floodlight in the wall about 10 feet up, with a cord. And, well, then they were looking at a metric ton of half-rotting evidence arranged amphitheater style to leave a space in front of the door free.
Do you have a problem with dead things?
Old Jim asked. because he did, sometimes.
Only if they're coming after me.
Cass said, deadpan, but he could tell that she was unsettled too. Barrels with large jars stacked atop them formed the lower level, with boxes and display cabinets next, so high the piles against the wall disappeared up where the light could not reach. He ran his little pocket flashlight over the contents that crushed his mind with the sheer density, the intense mania of vast numbers.
I expected banker boxes full of files and, photographs of this evidence.
Turtle and tortoise shells stacked in between the cases, taxidermied fox squirrels, the skins of raccoons and otters and mink. Some cases had fallen open, and out cascaded preserved dry feathers of house swallows and purple martins. Cass poked half-heartedly around the edges.
This is a display case of bat skeletons, and this one is full of butterflies. Never get through it all.
Because it was spooky. Because of the stench. Because of how the darkness of the whole formed the shape of a creature looming over them. Because some of the jars, preserved in ethanol, had been deposited roughly and cracked, so the chemicals had leaked out. Because the stacking structure seemed chosen without thought for getting any of the samples out of this silo. A rickety stool had been set up in the middle of the room, and under what looked like a handful of parking lot gravel, a piece of paper awaited them. The circular nature of the evidence assembled around it made the stool look like an act the audience had come to see. The audience in this case, the lower layers of jars of sea and river creatures, stacked 5 high. Thankfully, his nose had numbed itself on the handkerchief. Oh. Thankfully, his nose numbed itself, or the handkerchiefs were holding up. Had there been a deliberate lag between stacking the jars here and letting him know they'd arrived, just to add to the general ambiance?
There's a message, I think,
He said, and stepped forward to pull the piece of paper out from under the gravel, held it up to the flashlight with Cass perched in close, breathing a little shallow in his ear. But all it said, in large handwritten block letters on Hank's stationery, was Happy Jack.
Happy Jack.
He echoed. Happy Jack?
No, Jim.
Cass whispered, like they were in a church, not an amateur abattoir.
Happy, comma, space, Jack. That's what I said.
Oh, sorry.
Happy Jack. Happy Jack. That's what I said. No, it's a question, signed by Jack. Are we happy? No. Oh. Aren't you glad Jack wants to know if we're happy with this shit show? And that some underling wrote it down wrong?
Ah, well. Ah, hell. This was what men who had learned nothing did. Men who didn't mind repeating versions of their lesser selves. You're a mighty stain on the world, had been Jack's call sign once, and old Jim's countersign had been, and you're a horrible mess, followed, in more dire circumstances, with, Are you the one dying?
No, I'm the one knifing you in the back.
A life around Jack eroded the wall between do and not do. The message wasn't funny or clever, even if Jack thought so, because what Jack was telling them stank worse than the specimens. That they were welcome to whatever they could pick out of the remains, if they could stand the smell. That instead of a respectful fulfillment of old Jim's request, Jack had dumped on the edge of Bleekersville the complete inventory of samples the pyologists had taken over that long summer 20 years ago. No linguistics report, no analysis of any kind, just every collection of butterflies and moths and stickin insects, every row of pinned iridescent beetles, every tadpole euthanized for science but then abandoned to an archive or warehouse, Probably not even at Central, old Jim realized, for Jack to give him this so quickly, but somewhere closer. And Jack telling him that he disagreed, that this wouldn't help old Jim neutralize the rogue, that he was barking up the wrong stone silo. This sad, tired detritus. So maybe that meant they should catalog it, that Jack had gotten sloppy and didn't realize what he'd given them.
Do we try to go through it all?
Cass asked, as if reading his thoughts, and with an edge of anxiety in her voice.
No.
Old Jim said.
I mean, I do. No way. We're in this together.
Cass muffled through the handkerchief, both of them trying not to talk too much and let in the stench. Such a complex knot of feelings in his stomach, with her saying that, but also a sense of comfort, somehow, like maybe someone actually had his back.
Right,
He mumbled.
Take a stab at it?
Cass nodded, and not perfunctory, but like she really got it. No files, no analysis from Central, just the raw stuff. Rawer by the minute.
Must be something here,
He said, even though he was used to doing uncomfortable tasks that led nowhere. Prying anything out from the stacks would take patience.
It's okay if it's a dead end, though.
Old Jim had never seen an end deader.
Maybe try as long as we can stand it.
But Cass was already rolling up her sleeves, which old Jim found reassuring. She was going to roll up her sleeves and get to work. So they did. For a time. There came a moment when he'd thought they'd found something. High above, in the murk, the deep water feel of it, as if they were lost along the bottom of the sea, lost amid shipwreck, lost amid debris and artifact, lost amid ritual and Jack's wrath.
Get that for me?
He'd asked. That broke down Cass's mask discipline, and outpoured too many words.
Can I climb this mountain of crap to get that for you without falling down and burying us both? Because, what? I'm younger? I'm fitter? I'm more expendable? The middle thing, he admitted reluctantly.
Oh, never mind,
The middle thing.
he admitted reluctantly. She considered him a moment, there in the dark, in the stench, protected by his handkerchief, and then said,
Catch me if I fall. Break your fall, at least.
but he took it serious, watched her keenly, arms outstretched, and if she'd fallen, he would have caught her. Or hurt himself trying. Cass, anchored by one arm and one foot, leaning out over the abyss. His flashlight turned on her in that upper darkness, and from that angle, the forced perspective, the creatures in the foreground, she looked so very far away, and her face so pale, that his heart gave a little, a kind of twinge, as if she had become too remote and was fading away from him, too far to return safely.
No,
He said,
no.
and reached out with one hand toward her, then dropped it as he realized what he was doing.
Stuck.
She called down after considering him a moment. She was grasping for a small red object wedged between kegs and boxes and display cases stacked as if by some madman who had become an expert on balancing objects atop each other. And this one bright thing catching his flashlight beam in a way obscure to old Jim, there near the top.
It's really stuck.
And now she was frowning and shining a light on him, as if worried. About what? That his paralysis meant he'd lost his mind. He could not control his expression. Had the smell gotten to him, or something else?
Cut it loose,
He said.
drop it down to me and let's get the hell out. Or just come down.
Every word was torture, the handkerchief failing. Did he know she had a knife in easy reach? She did. Of course she did. Later, safely out of the silo, Cass would tell him that the object had been stuck amid the Mutter's fiddler crab cases, which were illogical, misfiled, difficult to understand. Because most, the closer she looked, had the wrong labels. Filed not as the fiddlers they were, but as butterflies, beetles, frogs, dragonflies, anything but. How far had the delusion spread? I guess that's not too surprising, optical antenna. Them being automated and all, they have however many automated phones that are dialing out all at once. Anyway, spooky though. They lasted exactly 29 minutes before they couldn't stand it any longer and fled, including a terrible moment when it appeared the door wouldn't open, and then, pushing together, it did, thankfully. The door made a clang as it shut behind them, and they tumbled out into the sunlight. Like grave robbers. Like bandits. Like escapees from the wreckage of the Dead Town disaster, released from those unearthly jars of creatures so long dead and yet newly dying a second death. Reborn anew. Blinking, ridding themselves of the cursed handkerchiefs, and laughing even as old Jim believed they both had expected more gunfire. But there wasn't. There was just the potholed parking lot, the bright sun on their faces, and they both took big, deep breaths and staggered around, bent over at times with the hysteria of aftermath. In the truck, he felt exhausted and unclean, like he needed a full decontamination process, or at least a shower, Cass with a look on her face like she felt the same.
Well, that was terrible and disgusting and worthless,
Old Jim said, as they sat there contemplating the road through a windshield stained white by bugs. You think so? Cass said, weary but impish suddenly, as if the engine that drove her never slept. Because maybe we learned something valuable. About the habits of the locals. About how fucked up our mission is. About old decomp. Like, avoid it. In fact, I'm going to call this place Old Decomp on the map.
I need a bar,
Old Jim said. His legs felt rubbery. He couldn't shake the weird potholes, the deep sea drainage, all of it.
Not to drink, just a quiet place to rest a bit.
Sure, Cass said, giving him a sideways glance, but I'm driving. On the seat between them lay their treasure, the red bobber attached to the tracker, from some long-dead alligator subjected to a pointless experiment during an expedition come to ruin. "13. Separating the ingredients. Stacky's tea stop had no pedigree to speak of, but at 2 in the afternoon no clientele either, and just the right amount of bleach smell slapping out from between the saloon doors leading to the bathrooms to make old Jim begin to forget chemical smells and rotting things. At an empty adjoining table, the relic of a blackened chicken finger rose above the wax paper covering a red plastic basket, admonishing him to only order water. For Cass it was a burger and fries, initially a beer, and then, with a nod to old Jim, a bottle of root beer instead, because the taps here will be salty and sour.
It's okay if you drink,
Old Jim said, kind of mumbled it. Didn't know what to do with her thoughtfulness. Camaraderie still felt unfamiliar to old Jim, like he'd forgotten the rules. Or the rules with Jack had been so different than the norm. Stuck, too, on the locals shooting the silo, which resonated more deeply with him the more the moment receded from him, while it seemed to have had the opposite effect on Cass. They'd situated themselves in classic desperado fashion at the back of the bar, on the same side of a table for four, facing the front door and whoever might burst in, guns blazing. While the bartender, having delivered Cass's burger, downed a couple of side-by-side shots of whiskey from behind the counter. Old Jim watched, incredulous, as Cass dissected her meal, using her hands to separate the top of the bun from the burger on her paper plate, place it on a napkin, and then carefully airlift to the side of the plate 2 tired pickle slices, a scrap of lettuce, a bit of onion, the slice of underripe tomato. Then she removed the bottom of the bun, placed it on the napkin, and cut the hamburger into 8 equal pieces, which she considered as would an artist of some new masterpiece. At which point she took a bite of bun, then smeared a piece of burger and ate it with some pickle, lettuce, and tomato, chewing contemplatively, only stopping when she saw the look on old Jim's face.
What? Are you checking for bugs?
She finished chewing, wiped her mouth with a napkin, gave him a look, and said,
You mean like a centipede? No, I like to see it all separate and then have the right ratios. And I hate onions.
I've never seen anyone do that before.
I always used to eat this way before the military tried to train it out of me. You should try it.
Try it? It would drive him crazy just to witness the process more than a handful of times. She speared another hamburger chunk and repeated the process. It bothered old Jim that she was going to run out of pickle, tomato, and lettuce before she ran out of burger with bun. It bothered him that she might actually worry about being a target.
I'm gonna give that alligator tracker we found to the psychics.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to give that alligator tracker we found to the psychics.
To do what?
Sniff it, she said. Pick up the trail.
Oh, like hunting dogs? To find an alligator.
That's about right.
Even as every night now, in support of actual science, he turned on the alligator tracker, hoping for a hit.
Maybe that'll turn up something. Jack wants to see real progress.
She wiped her mouth again, said in a way that made old Jim think that she was talking about him at first.
Control freak. Oh, maybe too happy about distant messaging and hypnosis.
But she meant Jack.
What did Jack tell you about Deadtown?
Old Jim asked, thinking of the rogue.
A high-level summary report. But it felt incomplete. Was there more to it?
Yeah, and I can't keep it just in my head, and I think it's important, even though it happened 20 years ago.
Cass said,
I'm listening.
and the last piece of hamburger was gone. She ate so fast, and yet savored everything. So old Jim gave Cass more details about the rabbits, his theory of the generator, his theory of the rogue, all of it, dumping it on her in that back corner almost, he felt. Oh, okay, I see what I did wrong there. Never mind. Dumping it dumping it on her in that back corner, almost, he felt, like Jack had dumped the specimens on them, only keeping to himself the fate of team leaders 1 and 2. That felt personal, or irrelevant, or he wasn't sure, but he omitted it. While Cass just kept swigging her root beer as if he were catching her up on the latest baseball scores or a 10-year history, month by month, of the high tide marks during storm surges. Even when he didn't spare her his pieced-together vision of the rogue shrieking as he ran across the blackened field, and, somehow, as old Jim spoke, he felt as if something evil or evil-adjacent was emptying out of him. And the relief of that he hadn't expected, almost as if he felt physically lighter. And even though he knew the weight would return, that he'd only banished it for a time, the absence meant something. When he had finished, Cass held up her empty bottle of root beer and shouted at the bartender like a drunk, "Need another!"
Come get it yourself,
he half shouted back across the empty room.
Fucking service around here,
she muttered as she got up, putting a hand on his shoulder to steady herself. By the time she had exchanged words with the bartender, put her coin on the counter, and sat down beside old Jim again, he expected she'd tell him he was a paranoid fool, maybe a delusional one. That there was no rogue, as he or even Jack envisioned him, no possible way that the events of 20 years ago meant anything to the present day. But, in fact, she'd split the difference. "There was a lot of old decomp you spilled," she said. "I was told that the expedition was a complete success, but I guess not. I guess, the opposite."
No one made it home. Not really.
But what if we separate out this idea of rogue, as you put it, from the rest of the story? Move away from him laying waste to the expedition with, what, experimental weapons or mind control? Because maybe focusing on that obscures the purpose baked into him.
How do we separate that out? He basically killed them.
Surprised that she could dismiss that apocalyptic vision from the dead meadow so easily. That felt like she'd had the intel earlier than today, or did she just have leaps of intuition? More like reckless endangerment.
Maybe,
He admitted, although he was pretty sure Jack didn't see it that way. So I think about what it would take for someone to do that, she said in a whisper tinged with awe, to be part of a 20-year op. And he might have had another 20 ahead of him. We don't know. A peculiar, almost unknowable look had overtaken her that he couldn't break the code of. He had a sensation of intel that lay far beyond him and had passed overhead in the night, headed for a distant star.
the mission is personal to the rogue in some way.
The mission is everything to the rogue, Cass said. He'll endure what almost no one else would. Do you do that for God, for country, or for something else? Old Jim felt close to an answer, but then it was gone again, and an uneasy silence came over them, until he felt a kind of pressure, a need to acquiesce.
I'll think about that. I'll think about what it means. Or doesn't mean.
Oh, I don't know what it means, Jack, Cass said wearily, as if she were older than him and more jaded. I just know the answers lie so far outside the box that there is no box. Speaking of which, the cameras. Did anyone do an autopsy on them? Old Jim felt a chill come over him, like crunching on the ice in his water had given him a headache.
Not sure what you mean.
But he did know. Maybe it had been in the back of his mind without realizing it. They look like toy cameras or something. Fake. I don't know why. That's what got me thinking about it. The chill cantilevered into his body like something was curving down into his system to infiltrate it.
An autopsy? They probably took them apart, but you mean a real autopsy?
Yes, I mean a real autopsy.
The weird description of the cameras by the team leaders was put down to hallucination.
Consider for a second what it would mean if it wasn't an hallucination. What if they did change? A kind of guarded look to her gaze, as if expressing the idea seemed dangerous to her. No one at Central saw a living camera.
A living camera,
Old Jim echoed. Yes, and we don't know what a living camera means. Somehow, old Jim wished he was back in his office watching an alligator tracker that never registered a hit. Later, exhausted, headed home in the truck, caught in an epic downpour that made old Jim drive at a crawl through half a foot of water, Cass said to him, sometimes I feel like I've been shipwrecked here. It's like I don't have the right tools, and I'm supposed to improvise. It feels impossible. Half weary, half frustrated.
but we do have the right tools.
The tools are rusty and broken, she said, and sighed.
If we fail, I'll suffer, not you, trust me,
He said to change the trajectory. Driving through the water made him feel as if he were neither on land nor at sea, gliding through a limitless expanse. She sat up a little from her slouch, like he'd caught her out somehow. Trust you? Do you really think I can, Jim? Or that you'll be the only one to suffer? He shrugged, didn't reply, even when she stared at him, just concentrated on driving. The rain assaulted the roof of the truck, and the fresh smell came with a drop in the temperature, so it was almost cool. Something had burnt out in him, some last flare of resistance, and he felt hollowed out and small and maybe a little foolish.
No, he said finally, you'd suffer too.
"14. Every sorrow." The green light and the cleft between the two mountains, but this time an army of house centipedes poured into the gap in endless legions against a barren, silent landscape. He woke gasping, as if he'd been deep beneath the sea, the little key cutting into his hand. The world was filled with forgotten places that had been something else once, had contained something else once, renamed by whatever you did there now. The idea frightened him when it came to him as he woke during the night in the kitchen, sometimes sitting on the chair, with his head full of the rabbit cameras, alligators, and a fading image of a burning candle. An empty vessel. A meadow of wildflowers was no better or worse a trap than an abandoned quarry where once he'd sat in winter, in a heavy coat and thick beard, and posed like a barbarian for Jack behind a rusted, broken-down metal desk. Jack had snapped some shots with the frozen waterfall cascading down the levels behind, and laughed, and the next night they'd come back with the informant and done what they had to do. It was no less beautiful the second time. The alligator tracker tracked nothing. The further examination of old Decomp's contents proceeded laborious through third parties, low-level players on Failure Island brought over for a perhaps useless task. He'd asked Jackie for files on agents killed or gone missing in the past 30 years, seeking anything rogue-like. But there had been no reply. Maybe that was Jack telling him they'd worked that angle, found nothing. The weather had turned colder, merged into fall, and he had so little that he wanted to report to Jack. Still not enough sleep, so when the phone rang it woke him up. Had he been nodding off in the middle of the day? How many days since old Decomp? For a moment he couldn't remember. The surprise. It was the phone for tourists, as Jack had called it, not the red phone for Central.
Old Jim here, he said into the receiver.
A sense of heavy breathing at some remove made him fight the reflex to hang up, and instead he waited out the silence. The static parted, and a voice came through the line.
You threatened me if I didn't call, but I have called, and you never answer. Not one time. Why would you do that to me? I've done nothing wrong. You should just leave me alone.
The voice had a musical intensity that disconcerted old Jim. The person was using some sort of distortion device, just not the type that made your voice sound muddy and gruff. No, instead, this person sounded lyrical, almost bird-like, but a big, aggressive bird, not a songbird.
Does it work both ways? Old Jim asked. The voice distortion? What do I sound like to you? You sound like an old man to me. How did you know? An educated guess. You threatened me. You wanted to talk.
The voice rising in panic. The mutter. He'd known, but it still came at him like a flash of heat lightning. The anti-medic.
Why disguise your voice? I know what your voice sounds like from the tapes. You can't trust voices to just be voices. What do you mean by that? A sound leaves a trace, like a parasite. In order to exist, sound needs a host.
That felt personal. Of course, that's how she felt. How unsettling and terrifying to continue her research in the middle of an expedition she felt was full of zombies. The generator. Her notes.
What can you tell me about the expedition that wasn't in your journal?
I have no value to you. That's what I'm trying to tell you. You can just forget about me.
Did you see who attacked the expedition at the end?
No, I told you I don't know anything. I was already far out in the marshes by then, leaving. Why won't you believe that?
A hint of hysteria rose through her voice.
What did Man-Boy Slim tell you about the situation?
How the fuck do you think I got your number?
Old Jim cursed. He was blowing this, head too buried in the reports and procedures. Now he did feel an urgency, but also panic that he didn't have the right questions.
Tell me more about the rabbits, the alligators, then, even if it was in your journal.
A hesitation. Then,
The rabbits made the alligator worse. No one wanted to say it because it sounded crazy, but the more rabbits the alligator ate, the more atypical it behaved. It did all kinds of things you don't expect from an alligator to write about it that seemed crazier. But in the moment, because we just wanted to forget the alligator experiment.
a terrible thought occurred to old Jim.
Did members of the expedition eat those rabbits, too?
I wasn't keeping track. I never did. But that's not why the alligator behaved strangely.
Then why?
Because it ate some rabbits that had cameras around their necks. It ate the cameras, and that was the problem. That's what changed her, the tyrant, I think.
What would it have meant? To eat a camera that was not a camera. He felt light-headed, realized he hadn't had breakfast, couldn't remember having had coffee. Why was that?
What about the stranger?
He had to come back to the rogue.
He talked to you in the bar once. A man whispered in your ear. Man-Boy Slim might have called him the Rogue.
A strong sense of violation in the mutter's reply.
How do you know that? How do you know that he talked to me?
Anything he said might provoke her, so he said nothing. There was a long pause, and he thought he'd lost her. Then,
Men always whisper in your ear. It's disgusting.
I think you know what I mean.
surely she remembered what the rogue had said.
I'm sorry.
What?
He whispered, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It should be different already, but it isn't. So I'm doing my best.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It should be different already. While he digested that, she rushed into the gap.
That's all he said. That's it. Like a lunatic. I didn't know him. I never saw him again. I thought he was drunk and he'd mistaken me for someone else.
What was his voice like?
Ordinary. So ordinary I can't remember.
Are you sure he didn't say anything else to you?
Something that had affected her mind, and she couldn't remember because the rogue didn't want her to remember.
I'm telling the truth.
Was it after he said he was sorry that you had the idea to leave the expedition?
No, he said nothing to me about that.
That hadn't been old Jim's question, but no point asking again.
Why did you leave the expedition that night? That particular night?
The hurricane was coming on strong. The expedition was falling apart. It didn't take a genius to see that, and I was scared.
Not because the stranger had told you to leave?
No.
I believe you,
Old Jim said, but he didn't know what he believed exactly.
No, you don't.
Maybe he didn't. It would be easier if what the rogue had whispered had been a confession, a reason, something that didn't leave old Jim in the dark holding a strange key.
Did you see the stranger that night?
No, we were already out on the mud flats, me and Man-Boy Slim, too far away.
Did you ever see the stranger after that?
Silence. For too long.
I just want to understand, old Jim said. Help me understand, and then you'll never hear from me again.
What is there to understand? There's nothing to fucking understand because nobody will ever fucking understand it. Don't you get that?
Where did you see the stranger? Old Jim said, patient.
A sigh, like the mutter was expelling every ounce of oxygen from her body.
He was shucking cameras like oysters. We saw him the next morning with the tyrant, shucking cameras like oysters.
I'm not sure I heard that correctly, old Jim said. Could you repeat that?
You heard me right, old man. We'd gotten lost and we heard him through the binoculars, and we saw him through the binoculars across a lagoon, and he was melting down cameras like in a bucket, like shucking oysters, except keeping the shells, harvesting them, and he tossed the rest to the tyrant who gobbled them up, right there by his side, like a fucking pet.
How did he do this?
You won't believe me.
Try me.
He stood over them, and he breathed on them, and
He what?
he drooled on them.
You mean like he spat on them? Saliva?
Just what I said. I know it sounds funny, but the more he did it, the more material he tossed in the bucket after he'd shucked the cameras. Well, it was like dry ice or something.
He spat on the cameras in a bucket and they steamed and smoke rose up.
It was long distance. I don't know what I saw. Why do you keep pressing? It doesn't matter. Fuck you. That's all I remember. Don't ask me any more about it.
What had the cameras been coated with? Some psychotropic substance? Maybe even contact with a harmless substance would make them bubble or seethe?
And the rabbit cameras. You viewed some of the video footage.
Yes.
She sounded sad now, not defiant.
How would you describe it? The footage.
If you saw it, you would have run as far away from that place as you could.
What does that mean?
Will you stop asking questions, then? Will you really just leave me alone?
I will. I promise.
But you keep saying that. You keep saying you'll stop, but I don't know you. Maybe you're not even who Man-Boy Slim thinks you are. Maybe you're trying to keep me on the line to triangulate my location right now. I won't be here long. I won't be here at all. It won't work on me, and
I didn't mean to.
There came a formless, primal scream from the phone, and old Jim held it away from his ear as the mutter began shouting. The mutter had begun to spiral, and old Jim hadn't recognized it in time.
you see a place like the coast. You see it, but it's different, and impossible things live there, and that lighthouse is a glowing green spear, and out at sea you can see ships split in half, and if you walk too far you reach a point you can't go any farther, and you're trapped while all the impossible things are hunting for you, all the monstrous things you thought were only in your dreams.
Said breathless, in a jumble, and he had to work hard to make sense of it, to see how the sentences fit together.
Take a breath. Just breathe.
He was trying to avoid saying, "Stay calm," even as his own heart rate had spiked. That would just send the mutter over the edge.
But I can't forget, and you can't forget I ever existed, which is what I want, and you can't fucking do it, can you? No, you can't. I want you to forget it. Either you or someone else will come after me and ask more questions, and I can't answer them, and I'll have to give the same answers, and I'm sick of having to think about this. You understand? I'm sick of worrying about people finding me and asking, and I don't know if I believe you. I don't know. I don't dare. Don't dare believe you. How am I supposed to believe you? The fact is, I can't, and someday you'll come for me, and so how can anybody have peace of mind in that? You can't. You can never have peace of mind. Something terrible is coming. It's still uncurling from that long ago moment. I know it, and it's going to kill us all, every one of us. It'll kill you and me, and I want to assure you that no one else even knows. Goodbye, fucking old man. Stupid fucking old man. But there came no click of the phone. Instead, old Jim heard a loud crack like a handgun firing, a weight hitting the floor, and then the receiver banging a table. Or so it seemed. He waited and waited. The line remained open. He didn't know what he was waiting for, someone else to pick up, but instinct told him not to hang up.
That was good acting, he said finally, maybe to no one, but I know you're still on the line.
The gunshot had been a recording. He knew it hadn't sounded quite right, like from a television show.
Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you! Leave me the fuck alone or I'll kill you! I'll come back there and I'll kill you!
Old Jim placed the receiver back on the phone. It was the kindest thing to do. For the mutter. Maybe no one had really survived the expedition except the medic. And if you thought that was a lot of fucks in a row, you are going to hear a lot more later. Ooh, boy. To the point it's going to be challenging to read. I'm looking forward to it. Sort of. Old Jim tried to go back to work, but he couldn't. The sense of being caught in a trap or a maze, the suffocation of that. He escaped to the porch instead. Didn't quite know what to do with himself. Sitting on the porch, doing nothing, helped. A bit. Yet, even doing nothing, he was allowed solitude for only a brief time. Because, soon enough, Gloria arrived on a bike, reckless over the ruts in the yard, clutching a crumpled paper bag against one handlebar. She careened to a stop in front of the porch, let the bike crash to the ground, and hopped up the steps so fast she had to skid to avoid pile driving through him and his chair. Her face was flushed from the exertion, and her hair was so thoroughly wind-tangled she kept having to brush it away from her face. She smelled like a kid who had been exploring mud and swamp all day. Her boots told the same story. She dropped the bag on the table next to him.
Mom's cookies. No raisins, just oatmeal and also chocolate chip. Thanks for taking the hook out of my foot.
You're welcome,
Old Jim said, looking in the bag. He had so little interest in talking to her, wanted her gone so she wouldn't interrupt thinking about the mutter's words.
You should read the note. It's from my mom. She likes you.
Your mom doesn't know me well enough to have an opinion about me, and neither should you.
Except she knew he had taken the fishhook out of her daughter's foot. That would be enough for some people.
Just read the note.
The note read, "Thanks for taking care of my daughter. Maybe I can buy you a drink some day as thanks. Trudy Jenkins." Sure. Right. Maybe they could go on a date while psychics screamed in submarines at the bottom of the sea. That seemed likely, seemed right. The absurdity of his life overwhelmed him. The sheer unnatural quality of that life.
Do you like the note?
This insistence on him liking the note irritated him. Caught at the wrong moment, or the kid was genuinely cloying.
Yeah, I like the note fine. Thank you, notes are good to write.
Mom says that too. She writes letters sometimes.
His interest perked up.
You ever write letters?
No, mostly I draw things. No, mostly I draw things I see. Starfish, lighthouses, pretty rocks. Should I write letters?
Well, depends on to whom, old Jim said. Sending a letter means something.
Or it would, unless you wrote 100 of them to someone who never received them.
What about that man you pushed into the sea? Will he get a letter?
So she had seen that.
No, he will not get a letter.
What about a postcard? Is that okay?
She was looking at him with an earnestness that made him smile.
When you only care a little bit, yes.
So he gets a get well postcard?
No, he gets a fuck off and die postcard.
Sure, why not? He can have one. Everybody can have one.
You sound like you need a postcard,
Gloria said. He laughed at that while she stood there, mouth open like she wanted to laugh, but wasn't quite sure why they were laughing.
Is there something wrong with you?
She asked.
Yes, he said. Now you should go.
She hesitated, gave him a look he could not interpret, and got back on her bike. Now he could see, half hidden by trees, that a car waited at the end of the driveway. Her mom. So maybe she didn't roam as far as he thought. Old Jim watched her go, wondering how he could dissuade her from coming back. The premonition of the urge to deploy her if she did come back, to turn her into a little spy who reported to him all unknowing. By then, old Jim had almost forgotten the wreck and ruin of the mutter. He almost felt like he was just some washed-up guy who deserved cookies for taking out a fishhook. Every sorrow might have its day, as the song went, but perhaps joy could, too, sometimes. If joy meant oblivion. Later, though, the itch came back, and old Jim went inside and pulled the rug out. The safe, and it wasn't strange, was it, that he'd spent the time on that, or that it seemed to have taken no time at all, appeared to him like a greedy little mouth, with its twin dials for the combination like eyes, and how could he be sure that somehow the safe didn't open a link to Central, such that whatever he put in was immediately taken out on the other side, back in the sterile cathedral? He pulled the mutter's journal out, closed the safe, replaced the rug, and sat on the couch. No one had physically examined the mutter's journal for a decade. When he had first seen her journal in the secure, climate-controlled environment, a kind of weight had lifted from him. Even having to view it via gloves shoved into a sealed chamber usually reserved for plague bacteria or radioactive objects. An unexpected grace and beauty, swathed in darkness, the light all concentrated golden on this artifact from a now ancient conflict. What he'd left in that space in the archives approximated what he held in his hands, even if he trusted no one would request a viewing in a month or even a year. Some reliquaries were not in high demand at Central, while others likely were hauled out at brute meetings, like, well, a monkey's paw, anointed with unholy water, blessed, preyed upon. As carefully as he could, old Jim pulled the journal from the plastic protective sheath. He was looking forward to revisiting it, with the idea that parts might mean something different after the phone call. Except all the pages had been slashed to pieces with something like an X-Acto knife and then patiently pushed between the covers to fit in the plastic container. He stared at the desecration, mind blank, truly shocked. Someone had come into his house to do this. Someone had known the combination to the safe. A kind of message from whom? From Central? Belt buckles. House centipedes. Rifles firing into the side of the silo. Secret minder or failure island sicko or the bad slack of the rogue. He felt bereaved, shaken. But it felt like a test as well as a message. So he replaced it in the safe, adding the strange little key, too.
Then he went into his office for the nightly ritual of turning on the alligator tracker, the usual moment of disappointment, which this time would also be the relief of normalcy. The relief of knowing that there was no tyrant out there, possibly no rogue from 20 years ago. He flipped the dial on the tracker, watched as it came on. The familiar green of nothingness. No signal to receive, no trace. Like he wished his mind would be, empty, at peace. Then the dot blinked red. It blinked red. He almost fell out of his chair. He peered at the coordinates, compared them to his fold-out map, heart beating rapid. It was in the middle of Deadtown? How was that possible? He tapped the side of the machine as if it had malfunctioned. The dot shifted to a different location. Shit. A scramble to look up those coordinates. Middle of a marsh, of course. Nowhere. Literally nowhere. Nothing nearby, no roads, nothing. As remote as could be. The dot hovered there for a moment, flashing against the green circles like mosquito coils. Then it began to move. Rapidly. It took a moment to realize the dot was headed directly toward his location. At speed. As if whatever lay out there knew he was tracking it. Old Jim shut off the tracker. He pulled the plug out of the wall. Then he took the whole apparatus and went out onto the black deck and he tossed it into the darkness.
You can have it! He shouted. Take the fucking thing!
Who kept fucking with him? Why couldn't he shake his dreams? He had no clue. Incidentally, those aren't questions. Who kept fucking with him? Why couldn't he shake his dreams? He had no clue. "15. The Monkey's Paw." There came onrushing the Friday night of the Monkey's Elbow gig, like a great beast coming for old Jim, when a new Commander Thistle would join the band for one night only. Cass had called several times, but he hadn't picked up. He needed time to think, to connect the dots, and he spent whole days drawing and redrawing diagrams that showed the Mutter, the Medic, Man-Boy Slim, 3M for short, in relation to the Rogue. In spite of himself, he kept trying to see some pattern that fit Cass's operational acronyms. But it seemed impossible. Cass's intensity about the Rogue, the idea of some higher purpose for him, some reason that ranked above God and country, it infected him at times, got to him in a way that felt like a yearning, like he, too, needed such a purpose. He escaped the trapped feeling of that and what felt like dysfunction by letting the bar job overtake him as the place began to fill up. A certain amount of good feeling in recognizing Trudy, Gloria's mom, with a wave, and less of that feeling noticing Man-Boy Slim walk in. But that was put aside as the pace of mixing drinks, pouring beers, quickened, thankful that the village bar had only a rudimentary toaster oven menu. Soon enough, the band took the stage, with acoustic and electric guitars, violin, keyboards, drums, and the vocalist, traditionally sans instrument, to broaden a limited pool. Trudy was on tambourine, like usual, the rest less familiar to him. The boisterous applause from a packed, standing-room-only crowd shook the wooden foundations, and old Jim gasped despite himself, no dust settling from the ceiling, no impact of missile or bomb. Just a band that, sometimes, drew people here from all over the county. Monkey's Elbow had some rules about their twice-a-year Commander Thistle as lead singer, a role held otherwise by Brad the Lighthouse Volunteer. You could not use your real name on stage, and commanders typically used masks to disguise their true identity, even if you didn't have to be a spy to figure out someone from their body language. Another reason the crowd had swelled. Every volunteer lead singer had to write a new song that would be recorded only for a limited edition small batch pressing, to be purchased, along with t-shirts, from a weary-looking gray-haired woman in a long drab skirt standing behind a rickety fold-out merch table. Commander Thistle came up after the regular members of Monkey's Elbow, a bulky man dressed in a strange hat and long trench coat that, from behind the bar, old Jim paid only half a mind to as the drink orders came in. But the audience oohed and awed at the elaborate nature of the disguise. Maybe because if you knew Commander Thistle, say, was the butcher down the street, you might not take his singing seriously. But then somebody at the bar had said it wasn't a popularity contest. The man's voice fit his image, rusty and slow roasted, with a hint of barbed wire, rasp but no twang. Nothing of the sea in that voice, oddly enough. At least, as old Jim thought of the sea, or even the way the sea had served as a backdrop to the squat barrel of the medic's own raspy voice before Jim had pushed him in the sea. Shining out like, shining out like, shining out. So the dark is no longer to blame. Shining out like, shining out like, shining out. God in his tower and man in his birth. Shining out, shining out, shining out. The shining out became less divided as it repeated, until the commas had been obliterated, and it could as easily have been outshining, outshining. He wondered if the song lingered in his ears from central research, or just déjà vu from other songs. A moment of recognition in the words he didn't understand. For the song or the singer? Looking at that implacable mask, he wondered what he didn't know about the here and the now. Not the past, with which he had become intimate. Not the future no one could see, but maybe what existed here, outside of the brigade, central, the rogue. The man's weighty head tilted forward as if to topple, mask still disguising his features. It was disconcertingly, with the tricorn hat, a premonition of the guillotine ushering in a new age. As Commander Thistle launched into another song, Down in the marshes, up in the sky, I see my God, Cass walked into the bar. A whole new wave of energy burst in behind her, in the form of five fishermen just off shift, ready to drink, and the festivities became more jubilant. Cass looked askance at the noise of them, walked up to the bar, and asked old Jim a question. But he couldn't hear over the music. He motioned to his ear, and she looked exasperated, waved her hand like "talk to you later," and said hello to a man and woman dancing to the music, who led her closer to the stage, so the three of them were swallowed by the crowd. Old Jim kept serving drinks. Maybe, for one night, they could both just be civilians. Oh, weary night! Oh, ceaseless journey! For how long could a band play without pause when their lead singer was made of solid stone? Candle, flame, or vessel? The question came to him again as a long treatise in his head about the limits of a middle-aged man's endurance, being both owner of a bar and in charge of a secret mission, the limits of which had become murkier and murkier. As the night wore on, while he washed beer mugs and gave Sally backup support, changing out a tap, then another, the rage of conversations as energy-sapping as the repetition of nautical terrors and misfortunes from days of yore. Were they now secretly a colonial-era pub? Wrung out the dish towel, had to hand dry as the dishwasher decided to malfunction. Couldn't be sure he was hearing the lyrics right, or maybe there was no right way, because so different. Oh, to be the burning light sinking beneath the waves. Oh, to escape this nameless plight and dive into a whirling grave. The way the black of Commander Thistle's mask felt like stark night staring back at him when he woke distressed. Despite the neutral expression on those wide features, the mask captured the beginning or very end of a scream. A sense of violence or disturbance lurked beneath the impassive gaze, the suggestion of thick lips in the pale flesh of the mouth hole. He checked. The key was back in his pocket, but he did not remember opening the safe. When had that happened? Man-Boy Slim had come up to the bar, and old Jim was instantly on high alert. He tried to find Cass in the crowd, but he'd lost her.
You know what I learned today?
Man-Boy Slim asked. The band had finished their first set, so old Jim could, unfortunately, hear him.
No, what did you learn today?
Well, old Jim, what I learned today is that what appear to be the stubby legs on a caterpillar are actually proto-legs. They're completely fake. The real legs are on its face, if you can believe that. Can you believe that?
No, that's pretty interesting,
old Jim said. Man-Boy Slim appeared to have lost his fear of black sights or an ass-kicking.
So anyway, these fake legs still help the caterpillar move around. Real fake legs. Imagine that. Can you imagine that, old Slim?
I can imagine I'm not serving you another drink. That's what I can imagine.
Man-Boy Slim wiped at his eyes like a fly had settled on him.
Yeah, well, it means something philosophically. Like, would you recognize a caterpillar as a caterpillar without its fake legs? And what if the caterpillar's disguised as something else to begin with? And if you carefully pull off the fake legs, would it walk on its face?
Man-Boy Slim started giggling at his own rhetoric.
Walk on its own face.
Profound, old Jim said in a neutral voice. Was he high?
I have to take a leak, but don't go anywhere. So many tales left to tell you. So many tales to tell on you.
Old Jim watched Man-Boy Slim head for the bathroom. The distress in the man. How it probably meant the mother was unrecoverable, that Man-Boy Slim would never find her, never talk to her again. He needed a break, felt like he was suffocating. Outside was cool and dark, the street lamp in front having gone out, and the country. Oh, whoops. The street lamp. Wow, let's just take the sentence from the top. I'm sorry. Outside was cool and dark, the street lamp in front having gone out, and the county in no rush to come around to replace it. Just a tinge of moon and the triangle wedge of green-blue light from the neon sign shouting "Village Bar" that let him see. That lulling sound of tide and sea, the hunkered shapes of the houses and other businesses, few of them lit up, along with all the cars and trucks here for the concert. The band noise buffered by the door, distant enough to hear himself think. He began to feel at peace when a boy and a girl stepped into the neon blue-green, their faces striated by it, bodies whirled and swelling because of it. No, not children, not teenagers. Adults. They just had that aspect, dressed all in black, the man in particular, the kind of youth preserved in aspic you saw mostly in centaurs and aging child actors. She had a demeanor of golden-haired innocence he couldn't quite explain, sharpened and estranged by the neon light. Her gaze was feral, her teeth sharpened by shadow. Two undead freaks, trapped here by the seaside in the off-season. Or maybe they were about to sell him some form of god. Someone reeked of turpentine.
Hello, Jim, the man said with a foreign accent. He had small eyes in an oval face, was stout but no muscle behind it, and had a stilted look to the slant of him, like his neck wasn't properly connected to his body. "Do I know you?" old Jim asked. He had his pea-shooter at his ankle and a knife at his waist, but not his Walther, because he didn't like having real firepower around the bar. "I think you do. In fact, I think you know all about us. You're the Knight Commander, after all, pulling the secret strings of Valhalla." Knight Commander said smarmy, disrespectful, and then Henry waited to gauge old Jim's reaction, when old Jim knew he wanted to say more.
The secret strings of Valhalla, huh? Sounds important,
Old Jim said. Or meaningless. While Suzanne stood there as mute as a wax museum statue of herself. "And I know all about you, too. Your insomnia, your sleepwalking," Henry said when old Jim said nothing. "All your pacing back and forth in your office. I understand it's a lot of responsibility running our organization. Must wear on you, Knight Commander." Jesus. Compromised. Surveillance? At a distance, from off property.
Got a point to this?
The point old Jim felt he might have to emphasize was a quick kick to Henry's groin and then a retreat back into the bar. Henry had come closer while Suzanne hung back. A good disguise, Henry's indeterminate age. You might underestimate him based on youth if you didn't know better. The adroit use of makeup and the put-together look of pressed trousers and crisply ironed shirt under a tailored blazer, along with good jeans, give a sense of perpetual youth, if also a whiff of school uniform. But one day, maybe decades hence, this man's head would sink like a shriveled apple into the ruins of a waiting wattled neck. "We want to know who your boss is, Knight Commander. You run Tricky Cass, and maybe someone runs Tricky you. And we want to know where the rest of the resources are, the money we need to do our critical research. Where is it? Why withhold it now?" Critical for who? For what purpose? A half-sister who followed him around like an unpaid intern.
Are you one of those Ouija hooks that roam the coast? Is that who you are?
Maybe pointless to pretend he didn't know who Henry was, but narcissists didn't like being treated this way. But Henry just laughed in a thin-lipped, mirthless way. "If so, you're the head hick, Knight Commander."
If a bird flies long enough inside a house, is it still a bird?
Remembering the questions the psych had asked him at Central. Henry looked confused, struggled to respond.
Do you exhibit glib and superficial charm?
"Is there something wrong with you, Knight Commander? Something breaking down, perhaps?"
Here's another one.
Old Jim said, his own special nod to the manual for identifying psychopaths.
A belt buckle and a brick are traveling in opposite directions, away from each other, the brick at the speed of a snail on a bad day, and the belt buckle at the speed of a waistline expanding at the rate of 3 inches per month. Which one will reach you first, if you stand at the exact opposite end of the universe? The snail or the waistline?
Henry smiled, revealing the affectation of sharpened incisors. Old Jim felt like he'd hit his target, and also suggested the Knight Commander might be deranged enough to do anything.
So, which is it?
Old Jim prodded, left hand resting on his knife. "Did you like how you were greeted at the silo?" Henry asked. Before old Jim could answer, a group of fishermen came sprawling out from the bar. They looked as rough as bare-knuckle boxers. Henry kept a cocked finger like a gun pointed at old Jim, even as the two retreated, receding and receding until they were gone, taken by the darkness. as if they really were vampires. Except, soon after, old Jim heard the cough of a car engine starting, and he figured they'd decided not to fly away. Old Jim had no stomach for going back to the bar after that. Not right away. So, instead, he braved the wall of sound long enough, Monkey's elbow raving on again, to duck into his office, and from there through the storeroom and out back, in search of the little bridge. There was just enough moon and glow from a back window of the bar to find his way. He could see the lighthouse's beams shining out, moving on, shining out, revolving 360 degrees to take the entire measure of the forgotten coast. The smell of salt and brine from the coast came up quick on the seething breezes. Henry had unnerved him, maybe more in what he already had gleaned about Central's operation than in his demeanor. What did he mean about the money? Resources? Was that just a shakedown? Or something else? The dull vibration of drums and bass guitar weakened, strengthened, as the distant front door opened and closed, opened again, along with the rough wail of Commander Thistle. "The stars start to glow, and the sun shines its last." He'd unwind for 10 minutes and then return to help Sally. Get his shit together. Talk to Cass, maybe, about priorities for next week. But when he stepped onto the bridge, he heard a sound in the water as of an animal moving away into the marsh. Some beast, large and ponderous. A figure arose at the other end of the bridge. Old Jim stood completely still. The figure was just a silhouette. "Man boy Slim, is that you?" Old Jim asked. The figure said nothing, remained motionless at the other end of the bridge. A nothing smudged by night. It wasn't Man Boy Slim.
"Who's there?"
Old Jim asked.
"Who are you?"
But he knew who it was. Whispering at old Jim, whispering and whispering, like a floating flame over the mud flats. Whispering and whispering, intent on the whispering, like some psychic, like some phantom, like some ancient, like something ancient and yet new. The Rogue. He tried to drop to one knee, pull the pea-shooter out of his ankle holster. But he couldn't. He couldn't. It was too late. Because the rogue's words were slamming into him now, slamming into him and drawing him close, reeling him in and drawing him out, until he was as thin as taut twine and nothing at all was left of him. Nothing at all, like it was always meant to be. Except old Jim's mouth was opening wide and wider still to vomit words, to erupt words toward the rogue. Words in patterns he had never learned, words meant to harm, and he heard the rogue shriek as if he'd been dealt a physical blow. Even as old Jim was falling down a deep well, a flight of stairs, into a crevice far beneath the sea, with no oxygen to breathe, no pulse, no heartbeat, nothing but dark sky above. Until his body felt like a vast blackened meadow with the rain coming down. Ah, Cass. Ah, Genevieve. What had he done? What was he still doing? Then there was nothing but darkness. And that is where we will call it for today. Things ramping up a smidge, as you'll probably see. Things getting a little wild, a little weird, a little weirder. Jeff Vandermeer does a pretty good job of just very slowly ratcheting up the weirdness, the tension, and strangeness. This book, I think, balances it out a bit better than Authority did. I think. I think I've mentioned this before, but I think Authority is one of my favorites of the trilogy, just because I kind of adore spook fiction. Um, but I can definitely understand why people find it off-putting, because not a lot happens for most of that run. This takes kind of hints from that and then kind of just adds a bit more pizzazz. Okay, that's going to be ridiculously short next week. I don't know about all that. But I can't really do both of them at the same time. Whatever, next week will be a bit short, and the week after will be a bit longer than next week. How many chunks do we got here? We're at number 4. So that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more. Yeah, that sounds about right. Okie doke. So yeah, things are going down, kids. Things are going down. I'm not calling people kids in the pejorative. That's just an expression. I just lost my page. That's good. Where were we? Right. Uh, so after the week after next, we're gonna have a bit of a change of pace. Something a bit different. 247. That's only 20 pages. I can't let it go at that. That's too short. Wait a minute. That's not 247. What are you talking about? Anyway, so it's going to be a while before I can get to interesting theories and ideas. Uh, what I will say is that I have a certain minor headcanon going on that sort of entails or requires you read the Ambergris series as well as the Born and Dead Astronauts books. I don't think necessarily that things are all interconnected, but there is a certain degree of recurring thematics that are occurring, which I think is probably more just a an idea that Jeff Vandermeer enjoys writing about. Um, we're going to get to that. This definitely feels like it was informed by Dead Astronauts, partly in the way the prose is kind of difficult to sometimes difficult to keep track of. That's actually not too bad. That is not as short as I was afraid it was going to be, which is good. Anyway, I lost the page again because I'm flipping, but I'm going to just take off that dust cover here. There we go. Yes, water lives here out to 266. Oh, that's much better than I was afraid it was going to be. Okay. It's not going to be quite as short as I was afraid it was going to wind up being. All right. Very good. Anyway, hope people are enjoying. I know I am. Part of me wishes I'd read it a second time before reading it aloud, but it's okay. This one's kind of weird to begin with, so if people are feeling a little lost and disoriented, partly that's by design, by our good friend Jeff Vandermeer, and partly it's because things are just very weird. Like you'll notice that interaction when Henry and Suzanne showed up, and like there's no introductions, there's no nothing. It's just, oh, here's two weird people, two vampires, and then it's like, oh, very apropos of nothing. It's like well after it should be relevant.
he says, oh, it's the author narration wise says, oh, that's Henry and Suzanne. Which you, as a reader, if you've read the previous stuff, probably have twigged to already. But still, it's nice. It's sort of it does a good job of balancing out being a prequel and doing something original. I know I've said before on this that I'm not terribly fond of prequels by and large because you kind of know how they end up. So what's the point? Um, this one does a fairly good job of recontextualizing things so that it feels relevant as opposed to pointless. So I give it some credit. Dead Astronauts is also kind of sort of technically a prequel, but it's more to Born, but it's more of a side quill. It's very, very difficult to explain that book. Um, I do want to get around to reading Born and I guess Dead Astronauts, though I'm not looking forward to reading Dead Astronauts aloud because that book is a doozy. It's a toughie. Um, I am absolutely positively though going to read through Ambergris on stream, the whole series. It's I forget how many books long it is. I have it in a collected volume. It's quite a few. Let's see. You have like Drayden in Love. You have City of Saints and something I can't read. Shriek and Afterward, Finch, and a few others. Actually, I think it's. Give me a sec. I gotta scooch over towards it. It's just outside my visual field. City of Saints and Madmen, which is a collection of short stories. Some really good stuff in there. Shriek and Afterward and Finch. Uh, all of which are radically different from each other in terms of tone. City of Saints and Madmen is a bunch of short stories. Great, great horror story stuff in there. Just absolutely top notch. I would put that up there with easily up there with stuff like Night Shift by Stephen King, which is one of my favorite horror short story collections um, by that author anyway. Um, it's very good, but all with kind of an interconnected theme using this city of ambergris as a setting. Um, Shriek and Afterword is kind of difficult to describe. Um, it's all theoretically an afterword to a biography, um, but it winds up being a biography about multiple people. It's you'll see when we get there. And then Finch is a spy thriller. So there's a lot of variety in the Ambergris series. Highly recommend. This is a book, Absolution, that we're currently reading that I definitely recommend getting a copy of if you can, and or finding some way to actually read it, because some of the stuff going on I am probably not relating particularly well, and for that I apologize, because it is just a bizarre book. It's very strange. It is decidedly outside of just about anyone's comfort zone, um, and that's entirely intentional on the part of the author. Uh, but very good stuff nonetheless. So for this Friday, we will be starting to read through The Lazarus Effect by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom. Hopefully, people are prepared for that. Uh, it's it's a bit more mellow than the Jesus incident was. The Jesus incident feels like feels pretty ratcheted up, like very high stakes. The stakes are high in the Lazarus Effect, but you don't really know it until later. Um, you'll have less voice of God um, or ship antics, um, but it is kind of there. You'll see. It's sort of a slow burn of a book. It takes a little while for things to ramp up. Still pretty good. Great characters. So many great characters in this one. So I'm pretty happy about that. But yeah, with that, I'm gonna dip. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Somebody did ask on the Discord whether or not I would be getting the Echopraxia uploaded somewhere where people can download it. I will. I'll cobble together a Google Drive account and throw it all up there and post a link to it. I will get that done this week. I will make that my MFG mission from Godot. And yeah, people can enjoy that. And next Monday, we will get started on Full Metal Panic Collector's Edition Volume 1. And I don't remember what the first story is called, so we will find the name of the first story. Fighting Boy Meets Girl. It is a rom-com with giant robots in. And a military thriller. It starts off more rom-commy than military thriller, but it gets there. By the end, it's all thriller, no filler. It's pretty gets pretty wild by the end. By the time we've hit like the third or fourth volume, it's like pretty crazy ballistic trajectory. Anyway, with that, I'm gonna dip. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. What I kind of wish I'd used as cover art this time, it turns out that there is a band. I'll talk more about this. Who did an album that has album art that references this and is indeed entitled Absolution. They're called, I think it's Tulipomania. They're kind of hard to describe. I've listened to the album because I had to, but I don't know if I'll play any of it on stream, but I might provide links to it on Bandcamp or something. Anyway, I'll see you all later. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent.